But if the question is such that you probably still are confused, okay, then you have to always remember this, that whatever the topic or question is, think about relating it to yourself. You will always have an answer. There is no space that you don't have an answer. You will always and always have an answer. So that's how you borrow some time and you respond to unusual questions. Remember, when there's an unusual question, don't suddenly panic, because of that you lose your confidence, and often people ruin their entire test. So don't let that happen. Stay calm, think whatever first strikes your mind, start with it and keep connecting. Okay. I remember a student got this question that describe a time when you observed a wild animal closely. Now, that person has never, like, wild animal, nothing was coming to his mind, and like, what to say. So what he did was he molded it. You address the question. Now listen, this is another tip there, adding to this part only, how to deal with unusual questions. You have to address the question, then you can mold it wisely in your favor. How? You tell the examiner that, well, wild animals, I'm not really, I would never go close to them, and even with my wildest of dreams. But talking of animals, I adore dogs. And then you can take the conversation forward with dogs. Address that part, but don't just instantly move to dogs. Okay, you have to address the question. You cannot just deviate from the main idea. Then you can take it forward with the connecting ideas. Amit, like I just said, borrowing time is only a few seconds that you can borrow, 2 to 4 seconds. And in those 2 to 4 seconds, also, it's not that you can keep quiet. You just have to say, okay, well, let me see. That's an interesting question to talk about. I've never thought about this, but I would say, and then you add to it. So this is how you're going to borrow time, Amit. Are you getting it, Amit? You cannot borrow 30 seconds, 60 seconds. You can only borrow a few seconds. So that's when you're talking only, and at that moment only you borrow and you speak up the next part. Okay. Are these 3 points clear? Number one was when I started that you have this point that you can ask questions, three situations where you can question the examiner. Number two, how to deal with unusual questions. To deal with unusual question, you need to borrow time, and I've just told you how to borrow time from the examiner. Three things we've just covered. Wonderful. Let's move on to number four. Number four is your part two. Four and five, tip number four and tip number five, both are associated to part two. With this, I'm going to tell you how to initiate your part two, and I'm also going to tell you how to structure your part two. So listen closely, everyone, those who face problem in their speaking part two. Which is this part two? Is this the cue card section? Yes or no, everyone? Speaking part two is the cue card section. Yes or no? Come on, tell me. Well, yes, Amit, that's right. It is the cue card section. You get the cue card, a question is written, and you have the bullet questions, and you have to answer that, right? Now, how to initiate part two and how to structure part two. These are the two last tips. Quickly listen to it, understand it, and then if you have questions, you can ask me up. Great, Gaurav. So, how to start with part two? Do not give it an abrupt start. Please do not do this. Abrupt start with that, what do I mean? People generally, let's say the question is describe a time when you closely observed a wild animal that I just now addressed, and you start with, okay, the cheetah is the one that I lately observed in the zoo or in the jungle or in the safari. You have given that an abrupt start to the answer. You have to avoid an abrupt start to the answer. Instead, your answer should have a backdrop. A backdrop is some sort of introduction to your main idea, and then you come up with your main idea and then further details to it. Listen, the structure. See the structure of part two. You have to start with the background information, okay, where you introduce your main idea. Then step two is where you talk about your main idea, you explain and elaborate it. And the third thing is, step 3 is where you add additional information, where you provide additional information. Maybe you have some more stories to add, examples to add, anything else that you can fill in that additional portion. I repeat, yes, listen carefully. Learners, your part 2 should not have an abrupt or a direct start. You have to give it a backdrop. Okay. Backdrop is where you introduce the main idea. It could be, for instance, that I have observed many wild animals, but the one that I vividly remember is this, when I visited, something like that. Amit, part 2 is not where the examiner is going to give you a card in part 2 where the question is written on the card. You get 1 minute to prepare and then you have to speak for 2 minutes. Okay. So, yes, if it's part 1 and 3, you have to first listen and then speak. But if it's part 2, you have to read. Okay. So, part 2 is all about the cue card that you fetch. You don't have to worry about listening to the question then. Okay. And part 2 is the only place, Amit, where you get time to prepare. Part 1 and 3, there's no time for you to prepare your answers. You have to instantly answer the questions as the examiner asks, you have to answer also. Okay? Yeah, great. So, structuring of your part 2 goes in 3 steps. Step 1, background information. Step 2, your main idea. And step 3, where you are going to elaborate it at the additional information. Okay. Jyoti, part 3 is more of related to part 2 only. The topic, let's say the topic is animals. So part 3 questions are based on animals only. You don't get any time, Jyoti, for part 3 questions to prepare. Okay, your answers. You have to instantly answer. Two key tips for part 3 that I would give you is one, give detailed answers. Don't give short answers. And number two, add examples to elaborate your responses. Okay. Examples can be fake, cooked up details. You can create those examples like false ones, stories or so. You don't have to be honest all the time. Okay, Jyoti? But two key tips for part two will be detailed answers, including examples. Okay. Very well. Yeah. So, speaking, see, overall, if I talk about speaking learners, you have to be natural and casual. That's it. Don't worry. Take it just a conversation with a stranger, maybe, and it's going to go really well. Natural and casual. Okay. This is what I have from my side for today to convey to you these key tips that I wanted to share, the secret tips for IELTS speaking, which probably most of you do not have. So, this is what I wanted to convey to you, learners, today. I hope you've learned something really interesting and new and useful. And hope and wait for another session very soon. Okay, coming week. So we'll come up with other modules also, listening, reading, writing as well, and we've had other sessions, so you can go through the recorded lessons also. Okay, Jyoti, I've just told you how to borrow time from the examiner. So I told you, no, how to borrow time. You will have to use these statements where you can use the fillers, and you can ask the examiner, like the question comes and you need 2 3 seconds to think, then you can say, well, that's interesting. Well, let me think about it. Or, well, I've never thought about it, but I would say. So when you use, that's an interesting question, I must say. To that I would add, and then you further answer the question. So you have to use those fillers, Jyoti, to borrow time. Okay. But you cannot just ask that, give me 2 seconds, give me 10 seconds, give me some time to think, because you don't have time to think. Okay. Yeah. I hope your queries are addressed. Great. All right, Jyoti. Great. So thank you, learners, for joining in today. And participating really well. Amit, Gaurav, and Jyoti, Sayan. Thank you, everyone, learners. Have a great weekend ahead and happy learning. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Goodbye.